Hey everyone, before we start this podcast, I have put out a survey. I'll put the link in the description to this podcast. The survey is for anyone who is Christian and autistic. It's very quick to fill out. If you are interested in filling out, please consider clicking on this link and filling out the survey. It is a survey about your specific positions on various statements within the Nicene Creed. It's for a upcoming article that I'm going to write, and maybe a potential podcast episode. We'll see. Before I get into the topic today, I'd just like to say this is a fairly sensitive topic and a fairly sensitive subject. I'm going to try to cover it as neutrally as I can. Obviously, I do have a dog in this fight, so understand that this will probably be more slanted towards my perspectives. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about eugenics, and specifically eugenics against disabled people. So if those are not topics that you want to hear about, this is not the podcast episode for you to listen to. All right, let's get into it. So before I start, I should probably give context as to why I'm even making this episode in the first place. And really the reason that I'm making this is because there was a big piece in the New York Times. The piece in the New York Times was titled, "The Next Parenting Trend Starts Before Conception. For as little as $2,500, you could choose your future baby. Should you?" And the article was from a person who is very enthusiastic about embryo screening and very enthusiastic about the prospect of what embryo screening can bring to humanity. She has been making podcast appearances and arguing with people online and on Twitter. I have been furiously tweeting at her to no avail, and this is just something that's been on my mind a lot, and so I wanted to talk about it in more long form and explain what the issues are and why people have issues with this. This is one of those issues where it's really hard to talk about it and give both sides of autistic Christian perspectives, where typically we tend to be pretty bimodally distributed, where you will have autistics on one extreme and then on the far other. Generally speaking, for autistic Christians, there is no bimodal distribution. It is very heavily skewed to anti-embryo screening and the various things around that. And I'm going to try to explain why that actually is. So before we even start, I should probably explain what embryo screening is. So embryo screening is usually a part of what is called IVF, or in vitro fertilization. The idea of IVF is you can pre-fertilize eggs, so they become embryos in a petri dish, and then freeze them for later implantation. And so you basically get a bunch of fertilized eggs. Those fertilized eggs split and mature, and then at a certain point you can basically implant them in a woman's uterus, and they will start to grow, I think. I'm not an IVF expert. Please correct me if I'm wrong about those specifics. But that is basically how it goes. One feature of IVF that is now offered is what's called embryo screening, or genetic testing. And this started as something for people with fatal congenital genetic issues that could be passed on to their children. Things that, like, 50% of the time would end up in their child dying before it reached its third birthday or something like that. And the idea was, what you could do in IVF is you could screen these embryos, figure out which ones will have that gene that could lead to death in very early stages, and which ones don't, and basically only implant the ones that will not have that lethal congenital disability. However, genetic testing has evolved significantly past that, and we can establish all sorts of things through genetic testing of embryos. We are at a point now where there are startups and companies that are offering all sorts of services, and you're not just looking for things like life-threatening conditions. and things like that. Of course, you could look for those still, but you can also select for more arbitrary features like height. Height is largely genetic, and if you want a tall baby, you can select a tall baby. Other things like eye color or hair color, general things like aesthetics, you can select for those. And then there are other genetically linked traits like intelligence or autism that you can either select for or select against. And the most obvious one is gender, where you can do genetic testing and you can figure out, are you going to have a boy or are you going to have a girl? Now, it should be noted, a lot of those things that I just listed aren't like on-off switches. Like, there isn't a single autism gene. This is like a polygenetic condition that likely has a very large selection of genes. Intelligence isn't a single gene. It is likely a large collection of things that comes from specific polygenetic conditions. This is more a field of averages and probabilities. Some things are quite simple, yes or no, like is it going to be a boy or is it going to be a girl? You basically just do genetic testing and look for a Y chromosome, and if it's there, it's there. Other conditions like Down syndrome are pretty easy to look for. You look for the trisomy of the 21st chromosome. But a lot of this stuff is sort of like there's a 60% chance that they will develop condition X, or the embryo will likely be between somewhere around 5'6" to 5'9" in that area. Genetics is also kind of complicated. There's like epigenetics and things related to that. These aren't like a one-to-one matched thing where you can basically determine what the child is going to be exactly based on genetic screening, but there are a lot of things that you can determine genetically. And the idea of embryo selection is we can basically pre-fertilize a whole bunch of eggs and then select only the ones that we want to be implanted and then brought to life. Usually, there is a selection here. And by that, I mean usually when you do IVF, you fertilize a number of eggs and then you get them implanted at different stages to see if the pregnancy will take. Sometimes the pregnancy does not take, and sometimes it does. When it doesn't take, it will basically spontaneously abort or miscarry, and then you go for further rounds of implantation. After you're done having children, or if there are embryos that you don't want because they have a genetic condition that you don't like or something like that, these embryos typically get discarded. And by that, I mean just turned into medical waste and destroyed. Because of that, there are a lot of Christians who are sort of skeptical of IVF and IVF related things. There are some Christians who do IVF, but do IVF where they start by fertilizing X number of eggs and then make sure that all of those eggs get implanted and that none of them are discarded. IVF is used in a variety of ways, and it has varying levels of controversy within the Christian church and within various Christian traditions. Some are fine with it, some are fine with it if you use all the embryos, and some are not fine with it at all under any circumstances. I'm not going to take a position on IVF. I don't know. I find it hard to care about the specifics of how an embryo gets implanted in a uterus. This is not something that I find particularly interesting or am particularly interested in dissecting the ethics of. The part that I'm going to talk about is the genetic testing and genetic screening component, because this is extremely controversial in autistic communities. And I don't think people realize how controversial it is. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about why it's controversial and the various different stances within autistic communities, and then specifically talk about autistic Christians. I think I'll first start by trying to explain some history of this by talking about a project called Spectrum 10K. Spectrum 10K was a research project by friend of the pod, Simon Baron Cohen, who is he's not a friend of the pod. I just mentioned him a lot. Who is a autism researcher based out of Cambridge. He is quite well known and quite prolific within the autism research community, and he was heading a project called Spectrum 10K. And the idea of Spectrum 10K is they were going to collect the genetic material from 10,000 autistic people, that's why it was called 10K, and do data science basically on that to see if they could find any interesting genetic anomalies or genetic similarities between these 10,000 different autistic people. And autistic people lost their minds collectively. And it was not well received by autism activists as a whole. And it was kind of just shut down. So it went through various different stages of revision. And then finally, it just didn't go to completion. And the concern that autistic people had was, you're going to use this information to do eugenics. The concern from most activists was, what you are going to do is you're going to use this information to inform embryo screening to ensure that autistic children cannot be born. And this is sort of the crux of why autistic activists care about this. When I talk about IVF and IVF controversies in autism, most people assume I'm only talking about autistic Christians, but I just want to be clear. This is not just an autistic Christian thing. This is sort of a broad autism, well, I shouldn't say autism, more of like a broad neurodiversity autism activist issue as well. This is something that they tend to care a lot about, and especially disability rights activists within the autism community are very concerned with it. And they're very concerned with it because autism has a very large genetic component to it. Now, we haven't been able to isolate every single gene that could be responsible for autism. Autism is a complex polygenetic characteristic, but we do know there is a very large genetic component to it. There was recently a large study that looked at various autism phenotypes by taking genetic data from a large number of autistic people to try to figure out if you could guess a phenotype based on genetic clustering and things like that. It's a very interesting study. If people are interested, I can do a breakdown of it. But basically, we've known since basically forever that autism has a very large genetic component. And the concern that autism activists have is, as soon as you discover exactly which genes do and do not cause autism, this will be impetus for people to want to not select an embryo with autism. And I think these concerns are pretty well justified. If, let's say, you are a normal couple and you go through genetic screening of your embryos before IVF, and one of those embryos has on it a label that says autism, and 3 of them don't. Are you going to pick the autism one, or are you going to pick the 3 that don't have the autism label on it? I'm sure there are some autistic people who would say, yeah, I'll choose the autism one, but most people would not. And the concern is that this will start to lead to the elimination of autism. Not only in IVF, but also early genetic screening. So you can do lots of genetic testing for various different conditions in utero, and then use this information to decide whether you want to terminate the pregnancy. So Iceland is very famous for having very few children with Down syndrome. And the reason they have very few children with Down syndrome is, as part of their maternal care, they provide mandatory screening. And that screening will tell you, is this baby likely to have Down syndrome? And they do it early enough that you can terminate the pregnancy if you so choose. And most people so choose, meaning that just fewer kids with Down syndrome are born. And the autism activists are concerned that this is going to happen with autism. Now, I've brought this up a few times trying to explain this to people, and they've said, come on, John, you know exactly what they're talking about. They're not talking about autistic people like you. They're talking about people with ASD3, not ASD1. And I mean, I wish that were true, sort of. Like, I still don't think it's great to try to eliminate people with ASD3, but I think you're sort of deluding yourself if you think that most parents want a kid with ASD1 either, especially if they have a choice between ASD1 and not ASD1. In most cases, I'm almost certain they would choose not ASD1. Like, I still don't think that's a good argument to be like, John, they're not going after your type of autism, they're going after the real type of autism. That doesn't fill me with much confidence, but I also just don't think most people want kids with my type of autism either. Like, ASD1 does not present as many challenges as ASD3. However, it still presents an enormous amount of challenges and a lot of difficulties that come with it, and most parents would not want to choose that for their kids. The next thing people say to me is, would it be so bad if we got rid of autism? And opinions differ on this, but generally speaking, autistic people say, yes, it would be bad if we got rid of autism, and for a large variety of different reasons. And it sort of ties into the question of, would it be bad if we got rid of all disability? And again, opinions vary, but generally speaking, autistic people say, yeah, it would be bad if we tried to get rid of all of it, especially ones in activist circles, especially disability rights activism circles. And that is for a lot of reasons. The reason that they are concerned with this doesn't necessarily have to do with the individual cases, but more in the knock-on effects that it would have, or the ways that it would shift public perceptions about disabilities, and the way that it would have sort of societal level macro effects on disabled people. Think about it. Not everyone's going to get genetic testing. Not everyone born will be born through IVF. There are lots of various different cases that are responsible for there being births. And so we're almost certainly always going to have people with disabilities with us. The biggest issue is once you start to sort of shift the way that we think about disability and think about the ways that we handle and deal with disability, it starts to have effects on the way that people think. When you basically say there is a certain type of person, and that type of person is necessary to remove from the gene pool, that changes the way that people think about that population. It also says something about how society values that population. So a very common example of this is sex-selected abortion or sex-selected IVF. Now, sex-selected IVF stats are actually kind of interesting because in North America, more girls get selected than boys. But the issue is that, like in some places in India and China, they've had to ban sex screening for children because if it's a girl, more traditional cultures would abort the baby and then try again for a boy. And when that happens, what does that sort of say about what society thinks of girls and things like that? Does this really create a society in which women are more valued if you are aborting them in the womb, or does it sort of perpetuate other stigmas about being a woman and those types of things? There will also be all sort of other knock-on effects, like huge amounts of what we value in our society are sort of arbitrary and culturally conditioned. Like, if you can select for blue eyes over brown eyes, a lot of people are going to select blue eyes, and that's not because having blue eyes makes you better or something like that. It's because having blue eyes is more culturally valued in some social circles as being more, I mean, like, quite frankly, just being more white. And in places where whiteness is valued over other over other ethnicities, you're going to have these effects. There are other issues that come up. And another really big one is that once you sort of add in that switch that you can flip to get rid of something or eliminate something, people shift in their mind to how we should be, like whether or not we should be obligated to care for that person. Oftentimes, when people have a choice or there's the perception of choice, there's significantly less sympathy for that group, or significantly less compassion for the group of people. We sort of have it built into our culture and into our consciousness that if you didn't choose it, you are entitled to support and compassion, versus if you chose it, you're not really entitled to any of that. And the fear is that if we start adding in genetic screening for autism, people who are born autistic are going to be seen as, oh, well, your parents chose you to be like this, so why do we need to specifically support you? The question stops becoming, what can we do as a society to change the way we think about and orient ourselves to these people that are different from us, to why didn't you just eliminate them in the screening? Like, why didn't you just genetically screen for them and then either not implant them when you were having IVF or abort them when you detected them? And this makes making systemic change harder. It makes the case for systemic change harder. It makes people not want to plan for these things long term, because they see, oh, this issue will sort of sort itself out, especially if it's genetic. It will sort itself out because eventually these people won't be as numerous. They will stop reproducing. We won't have as many of them. And eventually the problem will just go away. So why take any steps to help these people? And the people with disabilities will sort of be seen as these people that could have been prevented, or they'll be seen as like a victim of negligent parents or something like that, like a mistake that their parents could have prevented but didn't. And generally speaking, sympathy for, compassion for, and the desire to help people will go down, because it's sort of like, this is your fault, you could have prevented it, but you didn't. We gave you the tools to deal with it, and you didn't deal with it, so sucks to suck. And I mean, these things have real world effects. I mean, you see this in a lot of places that have MAID and euthanasia, where especially disabled and elderly people will start to feel like it's sort of an obligation because they're a burden. And this thinking of being a burden or being an obligation is very powerful and really affects people. And there are direct ties to things like MAID and genetic selection and things like that, where you are looking at this population and you're saying, yeah, it's fine if we didn't have these people. It's fine if we had a society that didn't have people like this. And as a result, people like that will just become less valued and less important. And I mean, just generally speaking, if you have the ability to eliminate diversity, and you do choose to eliminate diversity, society as a whole will become more homogenous, and that's probably bad for society. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this podcast and want to support my work, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting if you're listening on YouTube, or rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever app you listen to it on. Some people have asked me if they can support my research work and podcast, or encourage me to continue doing this work that many autistic people find valuable. If my work has been helpful for you, and you have the means to do so, I would appreciate if you could make a single donation or sign up for recurring monthly donations to the Against Malaria Foundation. I'll provide a link in the description. This is a very effective charity that helps prevent malaria by donating bed nets to people who need them. Each net costs around $2 and lasts for 3 to 4 years and protects on average 2 people. The statistics on this are well known. Every 600 nets that are provided saves 1 child from dying of malaria, and around 500 to 1,000 cases of malaria get prevented. Every single net matters. Even if you can only make a small donation, I would greatly appreciate it, as it really helps motivate me. So far, we've already raised well over $500, And I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to everyone who contributed. This does make a difference, and this really does help me want to continue pursuing this work. In addition, this podcast has merch. We use Teespring as a provider. I can provide a link in the description. There you can find many fun stickers that have themes that come up in this podcast, shirts, or mugs. Any of the proceeds from the merch will be donated to the Against Malaria Foundation and shared with the artists. That's all for now. Back to the podcast. Now, I've tried to be really careful. Maybe I've slipped up a few times, but I've been trying to be very careful to say that genetic screening and embryo screening is opposed by autism activists and people who, like disability activists and people in the neurodiversity movement and places like that. And I've been careful to try and say that because there are actually fairly large contingents of autistic people who actually kind of love genetic screening and embryo testing and embryo selection and IVF. Like there are especially in the sort of Bay Area tech world, love the idea of doing eugenics. And I often joke the the autistic mind yearns for eugenics because in many ways, a lot of autistic people find the logic of eugenics sort of unassailable and think, of course we should do this. It doesn't make sense not to do this. And especially if you look at the Twitter discourse around eugenics, a lot of the people who are like, of course I'm going to do eugenics, of course I'm going to do genetic screening for embryo selection, of course I'm going to try to optimize for the highest IQ embryo that I possibly can. Why wouldn't I? A lot of those people are autistic. And there's like whole contingents of autistic people in online circles, especially like the rationalist, less wrong types who are kind of enthusiastic about this technology and the ones who are super into it. And they basically don't see anything morally wrong with it because they don't believe that an embryo is a life or that a fetus is a life. And so that genetic testing and genetic selection just makes sense, right? Why wouldn't you want to choose the most optimized payload to be delivered out of the womb that you have chosen to implant your embryo into? And generally speaking, these autists fall into two camps. Don't think of these as two separate camps. Think of this as a sort of overlapping Venn diagram. So you can be in both camps or you can be in one or the other. But generally speaking, there are two groups, one that I call compassionate screening and one that I call explicitly eugenicist screening. So compassionate screening is the group of autistics primarily in like the EA rationalist side of the world who are really interested in eliminating needless suffering and the needless suffering that comes from profound disabilities and severe disabilities that often aren't very cute and are very acute and deadly in many cases and just cause a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. There are many disabilities like that. And these people think it seems like a morally good thing to either end a pregnancy when you detect this so that the child doesn't have to suffer, or to simply never allow it to be implanted in the first place and then discard the embryo. And they're motivated by a desire to reduce suffering. And then there's a second camp. And the second camp are the explicitly eugenicist camp. And these people are basically like, what if eugenics is good, actually? And really into sort of optimizing. They're really into optimizing genetics and picking all the right features. So group one, they're like, look, disability causes suffering. Suffering is bad. We don't want it. A lot of disabilities aren't cute. Many of them are really bad. And a lot of these people actually are autistic themselves. And so they know that autism is genetic. And they often quite like autism. Or I should be specific, they like ASD1. They do not like ASD2 and ASD3, and they think ASD2 and ASD3 are in that needless suffering camp. So they'll look at ASD1, and they often give analogies like one is called the race car analogy. I've talked about this maybe one or two times. This is one that Simone Collins uses. So Simone Collins, if you don't know, is one of those pronatalist autists who, yeah, that's a whole other episode. Yeah, so she uses this analogy of autism, comparing autism to a race car or a Formula One car, where she says, look, autistic people are a Formula One car. Formula One cars have, you wouldn't want to drive one on the highway. You wouldn't want to drive that on a normal motorway. But if you can get it to a racetrack, and if it has a crew to maintain it and optimized under certain conditions, it can go really fast, faster than any car imaginable. And we need race cars to go around the track really fast and things like that. And the analogy is basically like, look, obviously autism has downsides, but put us in the right place, and it's perfect for some things. And I think largely this analogy works. However, this analogy immediately breaks down when you talk about ASD2 or ASD3. And they will usually say something like, look, that's needless suffering. There is no race car here. This is sort of just a broken down car or a car with a lot of maintenance issues. And they would be in favor. If you could differentiate between ASD1, ASD2, and ASD3, these people would say it only makes sense to keep around ASD1. Many of these people are really pessimistic about systematic change and structural change and changes to improve lives of the disabled or things like that. And or another one they think is that you look at how much money it takes to maintain and sustain a disabled person, and they look at that and they say, wouldn't it be better if we spent that money elsewhere? Like, wouldn't that be better if we donated it to something like malaria nets? And they'll ask the question, like, why pay to support someone with Down syndrome when you could spend that money on malaria prevention and save lots of other people who will go on to have much longer, more fulfilling lives and things like that? And the argument is either, I just don't think we can continue to sustain this, I don't think we can make systematic change, or it's not practical, it's not efficient, and it's not economical to do this, and it's better that we just never let these people be born, or make sure that if we do find them in the early stages of pregnancy, we abort them. Now, lots of people probably disagree with that logic. I'm not trying to endorse it or anything. I'm just saying this is generally speaking what positions they hold. Now, group 2 is very different. So the ones who are explicitly eugenicists. A lot of these people, like this is a fairly large contingent of autistic people. They all have a lot of characteristics in common in that they themselves tend to be quite intelligent. They tend to be working in jobs that pay really well. They tend to be employed in sectors where being a high achieving autist is a good thing and gets you lots of money. And they worship at the cult of intelligence. And quite frankly, do not value the lives of people who are not as intelligent as them, or who are maybe like 2 standard deviations below them in intelligence. A lot of these people have very negative feelings about people who are less intelligent than them, often will derogatorily refer to them as like human chattel or cows or some other animal-based metaphor. It gets pretty dark pretty quickly. They typically, like I said, have high educations, working in high-paying jobs in top rungs of industry. They tend to be very focused on efficiency and streamlining and reducing conscious suffering, but also making the best people that we can. And they genuinely believe it is a good idea to be selective about which humans should be able to be brought to life and which ones shouldn't be. There was recently a post going around Twitter that was talking about a charity that basically went around paying people who had drug addictions to sterilize themselves. And these people were posting things like, wait, why is this a bad idea? This is great. We should do more of this. And many of them really don't care about the human experience outside of the high value, high achievers, and believe that if you could prevent the birth of what they often derogatorily refer to as low human capital or low achieving people before they can feel pain, then you probably should. Like I said, these people are explicitly eugenicists. They think that we should take control of human genetics and ensure it only comes to desired outcomes. And desired outcomes here mostly are outcomes that refer to people selected for high intelligence. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, autistic Christians really aren't in either of those two camps. Autistic Christians are overwhelmingly on the anti-embryo selection and screening camp. They are anti-genetic testing. They are really against it. Explaining this is really easy, I think. So recall previous episodes about abortion. The most common positions that I sketched out was abortion for thee but not for me, and then pro-life. Abortion for thee but not for me basically means I think abortion is bad, but I don't think it should be legally prevented. So they have moral objections to abortion, but don't think the state should be involved in forcing people to carry a pregnancy to term. And they often think that for reasons related to bodily autonomy or autonomy of the mother, that they should be allowed to have an abortion if they want to seek it. When you get into the question of genetic screening, however, that brings in complications, especially genetic screening in IVF or embryo selection, because in embryo selection, the embryo hasn't yet been implanted in the mother. And you basically have abortion without as many of the moral complications. Now, sure, the embryo eventually will be implanted in the mother, but before it's implanted, many of the questions of how you should treat this change a lot in the moral calculus of autistic people, of autistic Christians, and they generally find the logic that they had previously used to support abortion sort of goes out the window here, because there is no mother in this case. You are basically just looking through embryos and saying, I want this one and I want this one, based on genetic screening. And so once you get rid of the is this attached to another person question, and then add on, by the way, we're genetically screening these and only choosing ones that we deem worthy of life based on a set of predetermined genetic characteristics, most autistic Christians go, nope, not doing this today. We do not support this. Most autistic Christians who support abortion support it for the sake of the mother or because of the mother's bodily autonomy and things like that. If you remove the mother from the equation, they kind of just, the calculus changes a lot. Now, a lot of people, when I've been trying to explain this, will say things like, but that's not in the Bible, or the Bible doesn't support that, or the Bible's fine with this, or whatever. And it's like, okay, this is a kind of stupid argument, because whether or not the Bible supports this is irrelevant, because the early church definitely did not support this or the underlying logic of this. And they definitely had a lot to say about protections of disabled children and things like that. And it is not hard to imagine what the early church would have said if you asked them, should we allow for disabled children to be born they already ruled on this many times, and this is a part of the Christian tradition that autistic Christians tend to be extremely proud about. And it is a part of the Christian legacy in which they are sort of unashamedly proud and bring up a lot in interviews with them. And it's also something that you find on a lot of Christian autistic blogs. And it is the early Christian opposing of infanticide or child exposure. And to explain that, I think it's necessary to go into a little bit of the history of that. So, exposure was a practice throughout the Roman Empire. There are notably a few cultures that didn't practice it. One of them were Jewish people did not practice infant exposure. Tacitus talks about there being a few Germanic tribes who also didn't practice it, but Tacitus isn't always the most reliable, and whatever. This is not a Roman history podcast. This is mostly just to say it was very widespread, completely acceptable, and considered normal, with a few exceptions. One of them were the Jews, and not practicing infant exposure was considered very weird and odd and an aberration. The practice of exposure to a lot of us today comes off as morally shocking. Exposure is when you basically take a baby and leave it out to die and just let the elements kill it, or putting them in a garbage dump and letting them die and rot. And to our modern sensibilities, this seems wild. Like this seems morally unconscionable. But in the ancient world, it really wasn't. Now, there are lots of interesting historical artifacts from this. There's a famous midwife manual from the Roman Empire, and the first few chapters of this manual are describing how to inspect a baby before you decide whether or not it should be exposed. So the midwife manual, part of the practice of the midwife manual, is learning to inspect a baby for disabilities to decide whether or not you should discard it. There's a very famous piece of papyrus from the 1st century BC from a man, likely a legionary, named Hilarion to his pregnant wife, and the letter goes as follows. Hilarion sends many greetings to his sister, along with my lady, Beros and Apollinarion. Listen, we are still in Alexandria. Don't worry about this. If they go home completely, I will stay in Alexandria. I'm asking you and begging you to take care of the little child, and when we are paid, I'll send it to you right away. If you happen to be pregnant again, if it's a boy, leave it. If it's a girl, expose her. You have told Aphroditus, don't forget me. And how could I possibly forget you? Please don't be worried. And one of the things that sort of shocks a lot of people is just the casualness in which he says, oh, if you're pregnant again and if it's a boy, keep it. But if it's girl, throw it out, expose it. And that was very normal. In fact, it was so normal that there was a class of people that were often called foundlings. And foundlings were children that were picked up mostly by flesh traders, so slavers and brothel owners who would pick up these children that were exposed and raise them in their own household, usually to be slaves or prostitutes. And it should be noted that Christians, basically from day one, opposed this practice and never capitulated to Roman sensibilities on this, no matter how unpopular it was. And the Christian opposition to infant exposure was pretty much consistent and steadfast from day one. A lot of children who were exposed would be exposed because they had a sign that there was something wrong with it. Often this was like, some babies are clearly born with disabilities, but sometimes, they're bad omens and things like that. There were lots of superstitions that went around infant exposure. Children are often born with lots of hair, And if children are born with lots of hair, that's sometimes considered a bad omen, even though the hair will eventually fall off. And sometimes those infants were exposed. It was not a particularly nice practice. But in the Didache, which is a very early Christian text used for the instruction of Christians, it says in it, in chapter 2, you shall not practice magic, you shall not practice witchcraft, you shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is begotten. Which is basically a very clear direction to Christians. You are not allowed to abort your children, nor are you allowed to expose them. The Epistle to Diognetus, which is another text from the early church, probably 2nd century, maybe 3rd century, says in chapter 5, this is the chapter explaining to pagans what Christians are like. It says, they marry as all others do, they beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. And they're very clear to make it known, Christians do not practice infant exposure. Larry Hurtado, in a popular level book which he wrote, which I often recommend to people who are interested in early Christianity and looking for a good starting point to get into, I recommend the book Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctives in the Roman World, which basically goes over a list of things that made Christians unique from the Romans around them and the Roman religious practices of the time. It's a distillation of a lot of his academic work written for popular audiences, and one of the distinctives that he points out is Christians were basically steadfast in holding to being anti-exposure, often banning it whenever they got into political power, and forcibly ending it, or, famously, Saint Macrina, the sister of 2 of the Cappadocian fathers, was known for going through garbage dumps to pick out foundlings and to pick up babies and raise them in her own monastery. This was often done explicitly knowing that some of the babies were born with disabilities or had congenital birth defects, and Christians took them anyway. And they took them and they raised them as their own. This was done knowing they had disabilities. This practice was widespread throughout Europe, especially in countries like Scandinavia. When Christian missionaries were going there, one of the points of opposition that Christians often encountered in the medieval ages was these cultures clung to their right to expose their children and to basically weed out the weak stock. And Christians basically unanimously said, no, you're not allowed to do that. We're keeping our disabled, and everyone is going to be given a fighting chance. The only reason that the West doesn't currently practice infanticide is probably because it was Christianized. Now, I can't say that for sure, but if you look at infanticide practices throughout the globe, and the only places where infanticide stopped, where it was previously being practiced, it is often directly because of the influence of Christianity. In places where it was practiced, being completely unobjectionable, ubiquitous, and uncontroversial, Christianity came in, made it illegal, objectionable, and controversial, and against most of our moral sensibilities, where most of us hear, oh, they're going to abandon a baby to die. That's morally abhorrent. You are a terrible person if you do that. In the case of infant exposure, the reason that we no longer feel that way is probably because of the Christian influence that said, actually, you're not allowed to kill your babies. And the disabled children are actually going to live. Being against infant exposure has a lot of really interesting theological implications that a lot of autistic people like to talk about at length, that I won't really get into in this episode because we're already sort of coming up to the hour mark, and this would be another hour of me discussing it. So if you guys want me to go more into the various different theological musings of autistic people about infant exposure and the Christian desire to expunge infant exposure, I can. There's a lot of words have been typed on that particular subject. But the most relevant points that you get from a lot of these is this idea that within Christianity, because of its very strong opposition to infant exposure, it means that disabled people actually have just as much of a right and a place in society as everyone else. If you're not left out to die, it means you are valuable. And it means you're valuable even if you aren't necessarily useful, even if you aren't productive, even if you don't have utility, even if you don't contribute much to the survival of the group. You are still valuable. And there is nothing that makes you unworthy of life. And the sanctity of life extends beyond whatever disabilities you might have. And the obligation that we have is not to get rid of these people, but to care for them, to care for the sick, for the disabled, the orphan, and the widow, and allow them to live a life of dignity and respect, even if it means having to spend extra resources to keep them. And I'll wrap this up by sharing with you a quote from a much older autistic man. I met him when I was at a mess dinner, when I was an Army officer. He's now been retired for many years. When I talked to them, he was a former American colonel who had been a prisoner in the Vietnam War. And I forget exactly what we were talking about, but at one point he said to me, "The measure of a man is not how you treat your fellow man. It's how you treat those who can never do anything for you." And I think that is the best distillation of how a lot of autistic Christians think about the topic of embryo selection and the question of whether or not you should select embryos or whether you should do genetic screening. It's asking, how are we supposed to treat people in general? Are there disposable classes of people? What makes those classes of people disposable? Is it because of their use or utility? And what does it mean to us if we're going to throw out life? And what does it mean if we're going to stamp out life or the possibility of life simply because we can't see its utilitarian function? Anyway, that's all I have for this episode. I'll see you all again next week. If you would like to contact me, you can contact me by emailing me, christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can send me a message on Twitter or X @ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky @ChristianityOn.bluesky.social. Reminder, I have a survey. Please fill out the survey if you haven't already. If you would like to support this podcast, please consider donating to the Against Malaria Foundation. If you would like, you can also purchase merch for this podcast, proceeds of which will be shared with the artists and donated to the Against Malaria Foundation. Thank you very much for your time. I will see you again next week.